The statement came from a senior IRGC commander, broadcast on Iranian state television at prime time, and it was not ambiguous. If America strikes Iran, he said, Saudi Arabia burns. Not suffers consequences, not faces repercussions, burns. The choice of language was deliberate, calculated for maximum impact on multiple audiences simultaneously, and it has succeeded beyond what even the most alarmed observers of Iranian rhetoric might have predicted. Because the threat against Saudi Arabia is not, as some commentators are already rushing to characterize it, mere bluster or performance for domestic Iranian consumption. It reflects a genuine operational capability, a genuine strategic calculation, and a genuine willingness within the IRGC command structure to expand this conflict far beyond the direct confrontation between Iran and America that most of the crisis coverage has focused on. Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter, the custodian of Islam's holiest sites, the linchpin of American strategic relationships in the Gulf, has just been told that it is a target. And the world needs to understand what that means, why Iran made this threat now, and whether the threat is real. To understand the threat against Saudi Arabia, you first need to understand the depth and complexity of the Iran-Saudi rivalry, because it is one of the defining dynamics of the modern Middle East, and it goes far beyond the specific military tensions of the current moment. The rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia is simultaneously religious, Shia Iran versus Sunni Saudi Arabia, with both countries claiming to lead their respective communities and to represent the authentic path of Islam, and geopolitical, with both countries competing for influence across a region that stretches from Lebanon and Syria in the north to Yemen in the south. The two countries have been fighting a proxy war across the Middle East for decades, funding opposite sides in conflicts in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Bahrain. They have assassinated each other's assets, hacked each other's infrastructure, and conducted influence operations against each other's populations. The restoration of diplomatic relations in 2023, brokered by China, paused some of the most visible expressions of this rivalry, but did not resolve the underlying competition. What it did was create a fragile veneer of managed coexistence over a relationship that remains deeply adversarial at its core. The IRGC commander's threat needs to be understood in this context. He wasn't just warning Saudi Arabia as a tactical move in the current crisis. He was making a statement about Iran's long-term strategic intentions. A statement that Saudi Arabia will not be able to maintain its current position of trying to balance relationships with both America and Iran if it allows American military forces to use Saudi territory or Saudi airspace for operations against Iran. In other words, the threat is also a demand. Choose sides or we choose for you. Saudi Arabia's position throughout the current crisis has been precisely the kind of careful balance that Iran is now threatening to make untenable. Riyadh has hosted American forces, maintained the formal diplomatic relationship with Washington, and participated in the international financial architecture that sustains the American sanctions regime against Iran. At the same time, Saudi Arabia has maintained the restored diplomatic channel with Tehran, avoided making explicitly hostile public statements about Iran, and tried to keep its economic and energy interests insulated from the political and military conflict. That position, which Saudi strategists have worked hard to construct and maintain, is what Iran is now directly threatening. What operational capability does Iran actually have to threaten Saudi Arabia? This is where the conversation needs to be grounded in military reality rather than diplomatic posturing. The answer, unfortunately for Riyadh, is quite a lot. In September 2019, Iran demonstrated that capability in a way that stunned the world and exposed the significant limits of Saudi Arabia's air defense infrastructure. The attack on Saudi Aramco's Abqaiq oil processing facility and the Kurais oil field, using a combination of cruise missiles and drones that flew low and from unexpected directions, temporarily knocked out roughly 5% of global oil supply. The attack was sophisticated, precisely targeted, and conducted with complete surprise. Saudi air defenses, despite being among the most heavily funded in the region, failed to detect or intercept the strike. The facility was brought back to full production within weeks, But the strategic message was unmistakable. Iran can strike at the heart of Saudi oil infrastructure, and Saudi Arabia cannot reliably stop it. Since 2019, both sides have evolved their capabilities. Saudi Arabia has invested heavily in improved air defense systems, including additional Patriot batteries and radar coverage, to close the gaps that the Abqaiq attack exposed. But Iran has also continued to develop its drone and cruise missile inventory, improving range, accuracy, and the ability to evade detection by flying at extremely low altitudes and using terrain masking to avoid radar. The fundamental asymmetry that made the 2019 attack possible, Iran can generate more threats than Saudi Arabia can reliably intercept, has not been resolved. And in the context of a full-scale military confrontation with the United States, Iran would not be constrained to the kind of single-event demonstration that Abqaiq represented. It would be conducting sustained operations against a range of targets, using multiple simultaneous attack vectors, in conditions where Saudi air defenses would also be dealing with the general chaos and electronic warfare environment of a regional war. The consequences for Saudi oil infrastructure, for the processing facilities, the pipeline networks, the export terminals at Ras Tanura and Yanbu, could be devastating and potentially long-lasting. Beyond oil infrastructure, Iran's threat to Saudi Arabia has a second dimension that receives less attention but is potentially even more consequential in the long run. Saudi Arabia's internal social and political stability. The kingdom is undergoing a significant internal transformation under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, a transformation that is simultaneously modernizing the economy, concentrating power, and managing a delicate balance between different constituencies within Saudi society. The Shia minority in the eastern province, which happens to sit atop most of Saudi Arabia's oil reserves, has historically been a point of vulnerability for the kingdom. Iran has maintained relationships with elements of the Saudi Shia population, and in a full confrontation scenario, those relationships represent a potential tool for Iran to create internal instability in Saudi Arabia, without firing a single missile. The specter of social unrest in the eastern province, in the middle of a regional military crisis, is something Saudi leadership treats as an existential concern, and that Iranian strategists are well aware of. The threat also has a specifically religious dimension that plays out across the entire Muslim world. Saudi Arabia's legitimacy rests in significant part on its role as the custodian of Mecca and Medina, the two holiest sites in Islam. Iran has occasionally, in its most aggressive rhetoric, suggested that Saudi mismanagement of these sites makes Saudi custodianship illegitimate. In the context of a full-scale military conflict, Iranian rhetoric along these lines, carefully crafted to appeal to Sunni Muslims who are otherwise skeptical of Shia Iranian pretensions to Islamic leadership, could become a powerful tool for delegitimizing Saudi Arabia in the eyes of Muslim populations across the world. This is not a military capability in the conventional sense, but in the long game of regional influence that both Iran and Saudi Arabia are always playing, it is a real instrument of power. What is Saudi Arabia doing in response? Riyadh's immediate reaction has been measured in its public expression and intense in its private communications. Saudi officials are talking to Washington, making clear that the threat against Saudi Arabia changes their calculus about what level of American protection they can count on and what they expect in return for their continued cooperation. They are also talking to Tehran, through whatever channels remain available, trying to determine whether the IRGC commander's statement represents a settled decision by the Iranian leadership, or whether it is the kind of rhetoric that occasionally outruns policy. The distinction matters enormously. If the threat is a genuine operational commitment endorsed at the highest levels of Iranian leadership, Saudi strategic planning has to change fundamentally. If it's an IRGC commander speaking beyond his brief, with the Supreme Leader's office likely to walk it back privately, it's a different kind of problem, serious but manageable. Saudi Arabia is also accelerating conversations with other regional actors about coordinated air defense arrangements. The Abraham Accords have already established some degree of security cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Not formally, because Saudi-Israeli normalization has not been completed, but practically, through quiet coordination that both governments have maintained, even amid the current crisis. There are discussions underway about whether Israeli radar and intelligence assets can provide Saudi Arabia with earlier warning of Iranian strike preparations than Saudi systems alone can generate. The irony of Saudi Arabia potentially relying on Israeli intelligence to protect itself from Iranian threats, in the middle of a broader crisis that involves Iranian attacks on Israel, is not lost on any of the parties involved. But strategic necessity has a way of overriding ideological preferences. The global energy market has reacted to the threat against Saudi Arabia in ways that are immediate and measurable. Oil prices, which were already at elevated levels before the IRGC commander's statement, jumped sharply when the statement was broadcast and began circulating in international media. The market's logic is simple and correct. If Iran is willing and able to threaten Saudi oil infrastructure in a military conflict, then the risk to global oil supply is not just the risk of Strait of Hormuz disruption, it is the risk of damage to Saudi production capacity itself. Saudi Arabia produces roughly 10 million barrels of oil per day. Even a partial disruption to that production, lasting even a few weeks, would create a supply shock that markets are not positioned to absorb without significant price increases. The combination of potential Strait disruption and potential Saudi production disruption is the scenario that energy market analysts have historically treated as a tail risk too extreme to seriously model. It is now being seriously modeled because it is no longer a tail risk. It is a stated intention of the Iranian military. The international reaction to the threat against Saudi Arabia has been notably different from the international reaction to earlier phases of the crisis. Threats against American military assets or even against Israel can be processed by most governments through familiar frameworks. This is the US-Iran confrontation. This is the Israel-Iran confrontation. And while concerning, it is a confrontation between specific parties whose dynamics are understood. A threat against Saudi Arabia is different because it threatens the energy security of virtually every country on Earth simultaneously. The European governments that have been most vocal about restraint and diplomacy are now facing the reality that an escalating conflict that targets Saudi oil infrastructure would hit European economies with an energy shock of the first order. The Asian governments, Japan, South Korea, China, India, are even more directly exposed to Saudi oil supply disruption. The threat against Saudi Arabia has the effect of broadening the circle of directly affected parties dramatically, which changes the political dynamics of international pressure toward de-escalation. What comes next is a question that depends heavily on whether Saudi Arabia can be protected effectively enough that Iran's threat loses credibility, or whether Iran follows through in a way that demonstrates the threat was real. American military planners are now urgently reassessing the force posture needed to provide meaningful air defense coverage for Saudi Arabia, a task that is significantly more complex than defending a specific military installation, because Saudi oil infrastructure is dispersed across a large area, with multiple potential targets and approach vectors. If America commits the forces necessary to genuinely protect Saudi Arabia, those are forces that are not available for other aspects of the confrontation with Iran. The military resource allocation question, how to divide finite American military assets across multiple protection requirements simultaneously, is one of the central challenges facing planners right now. And it's a challenge that Iran's threat against Saudi Arabia has significantly complicated. The IRGC commander who made the threat understood exactly what he was doing. He was not just threatening Saudi Arabia, he was complicating the American military problem in ways that, regardless of whether Iran ever executes the threat, create genuine strategic value for Tehran. And that, as much as anything else about the current crisis, should inform how seriously the threat is taken.